Hello and welcome back to another video with Harry. I will be reading Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire by J.K. Rowling. Chapter 7, Bagman and Crouch. Harry disentangled himself from Ron and got to his feet. They had arrived on what had appeared to be a deserted stretch of misty moor. In front of them was a pair of tired and grumpy-looking wizards, one of whom was holding a large gold watch, and the other a thick roll of parchment and a quilt. Both were dressed as muggles, though very inexpertly. The man with the watch wore a tweeted suit with thigh-high galoshes. His colleague, a kilt and a poncho. "Morning, Basil," said Mr. Weasley, picking up the boot and handing it to the kilted wizard, who threw it in a large box of used port-keys behind him. Harry could see an old newspaper, an empty drink cans, and a punctured football. "Hello there, Arthur," said Basil warily. "Not on duty, eh? It's all right for some. We've been here all night. You better get out of the way. We've got a big party coming in from the back forest and at 5:15. Hang on, I'll find your campsite, Weasley." Weasley, he consulted his parchment list. "About a quarter of a mile's walk over there. First field you come to." The site manager called Mr. Roberts. "Dorgy, second field. Ask for Mr. Payne." "Thanks, Basil," said Mr. Weasley, and he beckoned everyone to follow him. They set off across the desert moor, unable to make out much through the mist. After about 20 minutes, a small stone cottage next to the gate swam into view. Beyond, Harry could just make out ghostly shapes of hundreds and hundreds of tents, rising up gentle slopes of a large field towards a dark wood in the horizon. They said goodbye to the Dorgies and approached the cottage door. A man standing in the doorway looked out at the tents. Harry knew at a glance that this was the only real muggle for several acres. When he heard their footsteps, he turned his head to look at them. "Morning," said Mr. Weasley brightly. "Morning," said the muggle. "Would you be Mr. Roberts?" I would," said Mr. Roberts. "And who are you?" "Weasley. 2 tents. Booked a couple of days ago." "I," said Mr. Roberts, consulting with a list, tackled to the door. "You've got a space up by the wood there. Just one night." "That's it," said Mr. Weasley. "You'll be paying now, then?" said Mr. Roberts. "All right, certainly," said Mr. Weasley. He retreated a short distance from the cottage and beckoned Harry towards him. "Help me, Harry," he muttered, pulling a roll of muggle money from his pocket, starting to peel the notes apart. "There's one, a 10. Oh, yes, I see the little numbers on it now. So this is a 5, a 20, he corrected him in an undertone, uncomfortable, aware of Mr. Roberts trying to catch every word. "Ah, yes, so it is. I don't believe these little bits of paper." "You forging," said Mr. Roberts, as Mr. Weasley returned with the correct notes. "Fortunes," repeated Mr. Weasley, puzzled. "You're not the first ones who had trouble with the money," said Mr. Robert, scrutinizing Mr. Weasley closely. "I had to try and pay me with great gold coins the size of Humcat 10 minutes ago." "Did you really?" said Mr. Weasley nervously. Mr. Roberts rummaged around the tin for some change. "Never been this crowded," he said suddenly, looking over all the misty field again. "Hundreds of pre-bookings. People usually just turn up." Is that all right?" said Mr. Weasley. He held out a hand for his charge, but Mr. Roberts didn't give it to him. "Ah," he said thoughtfully, "people all over. Loads of foreigners, and not just foreigners, weirdos, you know. There's a block walking around in a kilt and a poncho." "Shouldn't he?" said Mr. Weasley anxiously. It's like some sort of, I don't know, some sort of rally," said Mr. Roberts. "They all seem to know each other, like a big party." At that moment, a wizard in +4s appeared out of thin air next to Mr. Roberts' front door. "I believe it," he said sharply, pointing his wand at Mr. Roberts. Instantly, Mr. Roberts' eyes slid out of focus. His brows unkilted. He looked of dreamy unconcern and fell over on his face. Harry recognized the symbols of the one who had just had his memory modified. "A map of the campsite for you," Mr. Roberts said patiently to Mr. Weasley, "and your change." "Thank you very much," said Mr. Weasley. The wizards in the +4s accompanied them towards the gate to the campsite. He looked exhausted. His chin was blue and stubbled. There was a deep purple shadows under his eyes. Once out of earshot, Mr. Roberts, he muttered to Mr. Weasley, "Been having a lot of trouble with him. Needs a memory charm 10 minutes a day. 10 times a day to keep him happy, and Lupo Bagman's not helping. Trotting around, locking the bogers and quadlifs at the top of his voice. Not to worry about the anti-Muggle security. Blimey, I'll be glad when it's all over. See you later, Arthur." He disapparated. "I thought Mr. Bogman was the head of magical games and sports," said Ginny, looking surprised. "He should know better than to talk to bulges near Muggles, shouldn't he?" "He should," said Mr. Weasley, smiling and leading them through the gates of the campsite. "But Lupo's always been a bit, lax about security. You couldn't wish for a more enthusiastic head of sports department, though. He played Quidditch for England himself, you know, and he was the best beater in the Wamplin Rafts ever had. They trunked him up the misty field between long rows of tents. Most looked almost ordinary. Their owners had clearly tried to make them Muggle-like as possible, but had slipped up by adding chimneys or bell pulls or weather vanes. However, here and there, the tents were so obviously magical that Harry could hardly be surprised that Mr. Roberts was getting suspicious. Halfway up the field stood an extravagant configuration of striped silk, like a miniature palace. with several live peacocks tethered to the entrance. A little farther on the past tent, they had 3 floors, several tents, and a short way beyond their tent they had a front garden. Attached were a complete with bird bath, sundial, fountain. Always the same, said Mr. Weasley, smiling. We can't resist to show off we got together. Ah, here we are. Look at us. They reached the edge of the woods at the top of the field. And here was an empty space with a small sign hammered in red Weasley. Couldn't have a better spot, said Mr. Weasley, happening. The field is just on the other side of the wood. There we were as close as we could be. He hoisted his backpack from his shoulders. Right, he said excitedly. No magic allowed, strictly speaking, but not when you're out in the numbers on Muggleland. We'll be putting these tents up by hand. Shouldn't be too difficult. Muggles do it all the time. Here, Harry, do you reckon where we should start? Harry had never been camping in his life. The Dursleys had never taken him on any kind of holiday, preferring to leave him with Mrs. Figgs, an old neighbor. However, he and Hermione worked out the most of the poles and pegs should go. And although Mr. Weasley was more of a hindrance than a help, because he thoroughly overexcited when it came to using the mallet, finally managed to collect a pair of shabby 2-man tents. All of them stood back to admire their handiwork. Nobody looking at these tents would guess they belonged to wizards, Harry thought, but the trouble was that once Bill and Charlie and Percy arrived, it would be a party of 10. Hermione seemed to have spotted the problem too. She gave Harry a quizzled look, and Mr. Weasley dropped his hands to his knees and entered the first tent. Well, it'll be a bit cramped, he called, but I think we'll squeeze in. Come and have a look. Harry bent down and ducked under the tent flap and felt his jaw drop. He had walked into what looked like an old-fashioned 3-room flat, completely with a bathroom and kitchen. Oddly enough, the furnishing was exactly the same sort of style in Mrs. Figgs' house. They had couch cupboards and misattached chairs that had a strong smell of cats. Well, it's not for long, said Mrs. Weasley, mopping his bald patch with his handkerchief, and peered in the 4 bunk beds and stood in the bedroom. I borrowed this from Perkins at the office. Doesn't camp much more anymore. Poor fellow got lumbo. He picked up a dusty kettle and peered inside it. We'll need water. There's a tap marked on the map the Muggle gave us, said Ron, who had followed Harry inside the tent and seemed completely unimpressed with its extraordinary inner proportions. It's on the other side of the field. Well, why don't you, Harry and Hermione go and get us some water then? Mrs. Weasley handed us a kettle and a couple of saucepans, and the rest of us will get some wood for fire. But we've got an oven, said Ron. Why can't we just... Ron, anti-Muggle security. Mr. Weasley, his face shining with anti-patience. When real Muggles camp, they cook on fires outdoors. I've seen them at it. After a quick tour of the girls' tent, which was slightly smaller than the boys' Though without the smell of cats, Harry and Ron and Hermione set off on the campsite with the kettle and the saucepans. Now, with the sun newly risen and the mist lifting, they could see the city of tents stretched out in every direction. They made their way slowly through the rows. Eagerly around it was only just dawning on Harry how many witches and wizards there must be in the world. He had never really thought about those in other countries, and their fellow campers were starting to wake up. First to stir with their families, the small children. Harry had never seen witches and wizards this young before. A tiny boy no older than 2 was crouched outside a large pyramid-shaped tent, holding a wand and poking happily at slugs in the grass, which whirled slowly to the size of salmon. As they drew level with him, his mother came hurrying out of the tent. "How many times, Kevin? You don't touch Daddy's wand." Ick! She had trodden on the giant slug with a burst. Her scowling carried after them on the still air, mingling with the little boy's yells. "You bust slug! You bust slug!" A short away further on, they saw 2 little witches, barely older than Kevin, who were riding toy broomsticks that rose only high enough for the girls' toes to skim the dewy grass. The Ministry of Wizards had already spotted them and hurried past Harry, Ron, and Hermione. He muttered dispassionately, "In broad daylight, parents having a lie-in, I suppose." Yeah, and the adult wizards and witches were emerging from their tents, starting to cook breakfast, some with furniture looking around the cauldron fires and wands. Others were skeleting matches with doubtless looks on their face, as though they were sure this couldn't work. 3 African wizards sat in serious configuration, all of them wearing long white robes and roasting what looked like a rabbit in a bright purple fire, while a group of middle-aged American witches were gossiping happily, breathing in a spangled banner which stretched between their tents that read, "The Seaman Witches Institute." Harry caught snatches of the conversation in strange languages from the inside of tents they passed. Though he couldn't understand a word, the tone of every single voice was the same. Is it my eyes, or has everything gone green?" said Ron. It wasn't just Ron's eyes. They had walked into a patch of tents that were all converted with thick growth of shamrocks, so that it looked as though small, oddly shaped hill rocks had sprouted out of the earth. Grinning faces could be seen under those, and had their flaps opened from behind them. They had heard his names. Harry, Ron, Hermione? It was Severus Finnegan, their fellow Gryffindor 4th year. He was sitting in front of his own shamrock-covered tent when a sandy-haired woman, who had to be his mother, and his best friend, Dean Thomas, also a Gryffindor. "Like the Disrations," said Severus, grinning. "The Ministry's not too happy." "Ah, why shouldn't we show our colours?" said Mrs. Finnegan. "They're tents. You'll be supporting Ireland, of course," she added, eyeing Harry and Ron and Hermione when they had assured her that they were indeed supporting Ireland, and set off. Though Ron said, "We like to say anything else surrounded by that lot." "I wonder what the Bolgans have got dangling over their tents," said Hermione. "Let's go have a look," said Harry, pointing at a large patch of tents upfield with the Berlin flag, white, green, and red, was fluttering in the breeze. The tents there had not been bedecked with plant life. Each one had the same poster attached to it, a poster that was very surely a face with heavy black eyebrows, a picture of course moving, but all it did was blink and scowl. "Crumb," said Ron quietly. "What?" said Hermione. "Crumb," said Ron. "Victor Crumb, the Brennan Seeker. He looks really grumpy," said Hermione, looking around at many Crumbs, blinking and scowling at them. "Really grumpy." Ron raised his eyes to the heavens. "Who cares what he looks like? He's unbelievable. He's really young, too. Only 18 or something. He's a genius. Wait until tonight and you'll see." There were already a small, quaint feather tap in the corner of the field. Harry, Ron, and Hermione joined it, right behind a pair of men who were having a heated argument. One of them was a very old wizard who was wearing a long, flowery nightgown. The other was clearly a ministry wizard, holding a pair of pinstripe trousers, almost crying with exasperation. "Just put them on, Archie. There's a good chap, and you can't walk around like this. The muggles at the gate already are getting suspicious." "I bought this in a muggle shop," said the odd wizard stubbornly. "Muggles wear them." "Muggle women wear them, Archie, not men, and they're wearing these," said the ministry wizard. He had brandished pinstripe trousers. "I'm not putting them on," said old Archie in indignation. "I really like a healthy breeze around, thanks." Hermione was overcome with such strong fitted giggles that at that point she had ducked out of the Queen and only returned when Archie had collected his water and moved away. Walking more slowly now because of the weight of the water, they made their way back to the campsite. Here and there they saw more familiar faces from Hogwarts students and familiar families. Oliver Wood, the old captain of Harry's house Quidditch team, who had just left Hogwarts, dragging Harry over his parents' tent, introduced him. He told him excitedly he had just been sighted by the Plundrim United Reserve Team. Next they were halted by Ernie Melkin, a Hufflepuff fourth year, and littered further on the way they saw Chow Chang, a very pretty girl who played Seeker on the Ravenclaw team. She waved and smiled at Harry, who sloped quite a lot of water down the front, and he waved back. More to stop Ron from smirking than anything, Harry hurried and pointed out a large group of teenagers who had never seen before. "Who do you reckon they are? They don't go to Hogwarts, do they?" "Suspect they got to more fortunate schools," said Ron. "I know there are others. Never met anyone who went to them, though. Bill had a pen friend at a school in Brazil. This was years and years ago. He wanted to go on an exchange trip. Mom and Dad couldn't afford it, His pen friend got all offended when he said he wasn't going and sent him a cursed hat that made his ears shriveled up. Harry laughed, but didn't voice his amazement that he felt for hearing about the other wizard school. He supposed now they saw the relatives of so many nation allies in the campsite that they had won. He glanced at Hermione, who looked utterly unsurprised by the information. No doubt she had run across the news about the other wizarding schools, some book or another. You've been ages, said George when they finally got back to the Weasley's tents. Met a few people, said Ron, sitting the water down. You've got that fire started yet? Dad's having fun with the matches, said Fred. Mr. Weasley has had no success at all in lighting the fire, but he wasn't for the lack of trying. He splittered matches and littered them on the ground around him. He looked as though he was having the time of his life. Oops, he had managed to light one properly and dropped it in surprise. How come, Mr. Weasley, said Hermione kindly, taking the box from him and showing him how to do it properly. At last he got the fire lit. It was at least another hour before it was hot enough to cook anything. It was completely to watch while they waited and hovered their tent, and seemed to be pitched right alongside through there into the field. The ministry members kept hurrying up and down, greeting Mr. Weasley cordially as they passed Mr. Weasley, kept running complimentary. Mainly for Harry and Hermione's benefits, his own children knew too much about the ministry to be greatly interested. There was Cronbrook Mockridge, head of the Goblin last office. He comes. Gilbert Whelan, he's in the committee on experimental charms, who has horns for a while now. Hello, Arnie. And Arnold Pleasegood, he's an observer member of the Accidental Magic Retrieval Squad. You know, that broad choker, they're unspeakables. They're what? For the Department of Mysteries. Top secret, no idea what they go up to. At last, the fire was ready. They had just started cooking an egg and the sausages. Bill and Charlie and Percy came strolling out of the woods towards them. Just apparated, Dad, said Percy loudly. An excited lunch. They're halfway through their plates of eggs and sausages when Mr. Weasley jumped to his feet. He was grinning at the man who was striding towards them. Ah, the man of the moment, Lupo. Lupo Bagman was easily the most noticeable person Harry had ever seen so far, including old Archie, who was flowering nightdress. He was wearing long Quidditch robes and a thick horizontal stripe of bright yellow and black, an enormous picture of a wasp that was splashing across his chest. He had a look of powerful built man gone slightly to seed. His robe was stretched tightly across his large belly. He had surely had not had in the days when he played Quidditch for England. He wears his squashed, probably broken by a stray burglar, Harry thought. His nose was squashed, but his round blue eyes, short blonde hair, had rose complexion that made him look very overgrown schoolboy. "Ahoy there, bagman," called happily. He walked as though he had been spring attached to the balls of his feet. He was plainly in a state of wild excitement. "Arthur, old man," he preferred as he reached the campsite. "What a day, eh? What a day. Could we have asked for more perfect weather? A cloudless night coming. Hardly a hiccup in the arrangements. Not much for me to do." Behind him was a group of hang-looking ministry wizards rushed past, pointing distant evidence in the same sort of magical fire that was spreading the violet sparks 20 feet into the air. Percy hurried forward with his hand outstretched. Apparently, his disapproval of the way Lupo Bagman ran the department did not prevent him from waiting to make a good impression. "Ah, yes," said Mr. Weasley, grinning. "That's my son Percy. He just started in the ministry. And this is Fred. No, George. Sorry, that's Fred. Bill, Charlie, Ron. My daughter Ginny. Ron's friends, Hermione Granger, Harry Potter." Bagman did the smallest of double takes when he heard Harry's name. His eyes performed a familiar flick upward to his scar on his forehead. "Everyone," Mr. Weasley continued, "this is Lupo Bagman. You know him. He knows who he is. Thanks to him, we've got such good tickets." Bagman beamed and waved his hands as if to say he'd been nothing. "Fancy and a fluttering unmatched, Arthur," he said eagerly, jiggling what seemed to be a large pound of gold in his pockets. "Yellow and black robes. I've already got Randy Partner beating me Belgium with his score first. I offered a nice odds, considering Ireland's front three, and they're the strongest I've seen in years. A little Argentimus has put half shares in her eel farm on a week-long match." "Oh, go on then," said Mr. Weasley. "Let's see, a gallon on Ireland to win." "A gallon?" said Lupo, slightly disappointed, and recovered himself. "Well, very well then. Any other takes?" "They're a bit young to be gambling," says Mr. Weasley, "and Molly wouldn't like it." Molly wouldn't like it. "Will be 37 gallons, 15 Snickles, and 3 Canucks," said Fred, and he and George quickly pooled out all their money. "That's Ireland wins, but Victor Crumb gets the snitch. Oh, and we'll throw in a fake wand. You don't want to go showing Mr. Bagman rubbish like that," Percy hissed. And Bagman didn't seem to think the wand was rubbish at all. In contrary, his boyish face shone with excitement as he took it from Fred. He gave the wand a wave, and a loud squawk turned into a rubber chicken. Bagman roared with laughter. "Excellent! I haven't seen one that convincing in years. I'd pay 5 gallons for that." Percy froze in an attitude of stunned disapproval. "Boys," said Mr. Weasley under his breath, you don't want beating that all your savings. Your mother, don't be a spoil sport, Arthur," boomed Lehman Bagman, rattling his pockets eagerly. They're old enough to know what they want. I reckon Ireland will win, but Victor Crumb won't get the snitch. Not a chance, boys, not a chance. I'll give you excellent odds on that one. Well, I'll add 5 gallons for a funny wand. Then we shall. Mr. Weasley looked on helplessly at Lupo and whipped out a notebook and quill and began jotting down the twins' names. Cheers, said Mr. Gulney, taking a slip of parchment, Bagman's hundreds, and tucking it away in front of his robes. Bagman turned most cheerfully back at Mr. Weasley. Couldn't do me boo, I suppose. He kept keeping an eye out for Barney Crouch. My Bosman's opposite numbers making difficulties. I can't understand a word that he's saying. Barely's be able to sort it out. He speaks in about 150 languages. Mr. Crouch, said Percy suddenly, abandoning his look for the poker stiff disapproval and positively writing with excitement. He speaks over 200. Bowlish and Goblet and Troll. Anyone can speak Troll, said Fred dismayingly. All you have to do is point and grunt. Percy threw Fred an extremely nasty look and stoked in fire, obviously bringing the kettle back to a boil. Any news for Bertha Jorkins yet, Lupo? Said Mr. Weasley, asked as Bagman settled himself down in the grass beside them all. Not a bird, said Bagman comfortably, but she'll turn up. Per old Bertha's memory, like a leaky cauldron, no sense of direction. Lost. Take my word for it, she'll wander back into the office sometime in October, thinking it's still July. You don't think it might be time to send someone to look for her, Mr. Weasley suggests, tentatively, as Percy handed Bagman his tea. Bartley Crouch keeps saying, said Bagman, who rolled his eyes, widening in excitement. Widling innocent, but we really can't spare anyone at the moment. Oh, talk of the devil, Bartley, a wizard that had just appeared at the fireside. I could not have made more of a contrast when Lupo Bagman sprawled and the grass his old wobbly robes. Bartley Crouch had a stiff, upright, elderly man dressed in an inconceivable crisp suit and tie, powering in his short grey hair, almost unnaturally straightened. Narrow toothbrush mustache that looked as though he had trimmed it using a side ruler. His nose was very high and polished. Harry could see at once why Percy idolized him. Percy was a great believer in the regal muggle dressing, as though he could pass it for a bank manager. Harry doubled, even Uncle Burden could be spotted him for what he really was. He pulled up a bit of grass. Bartley, said Lupo brightly, putting round beside him. No, thank you, Loto, said Crouch. There was a bite of impatience in his voice. I've been looking for you everywhere. and the Bulgarians are interested in whether add another several seats at the top of the box. Is that what they're after? Said Bagman, as though the champ had asked him to borrow a pair of tweezers. A bit of strong ancients, Mr. Crouch, said Percy, breathless, stunk into a kind of half-brow that made him look like a hunchback. Would you like a cup of tea? Oh, yes, said Mr. Crouch, looking over Percy with mild surprise. Yes, thank you. Whether by Fred and George choked in their own cups, Percy very pink around the ears, and bruised himself with a kettle. Oh, I've been wanting a word with you too, Arthur, said Mr. Crouch, his sharp eyes falling upon Mr. Weasley, abolish on the raft. He wants a word with you about your embargo on the fiery champers. Mr. Weasley heaved a deep sigh. I sent an old owl about just last week. I've told him once. I've told him 100 times. Carpets are definitely a Muggle artifact. By the Registry of Postal Charmed Objects. But will he listen? I doubt it, said Mr. Crouch, preparing a cup of tea from Percy. He is desperate to export here. Well, there'll never be replaced brooms in Britain, will they? Said Bagman. Oh, I think there's eminence in the mark for a family vehicle, said Mr. Crouch. I remember my grandfather had an Enix Master that could sit 12, but that was before charms were banned. Of course, he poked as though he wanted to leave. Nobody with any doubt that all his ancestors had abided strict by the law. So keeping busy, Bartley, said Bagman breezily. Fairly, said Mr. Crouch dully, organizing the portkeys across 5 continents. In no means feat, Lupo. I expect you'll both be glad when it's all over, said Mr. Weasley. Lupo Bagman looked shocked. Glad? Don't look when I have all the fun. Still, it's not as though we've got anything to look forward to, eh, Britley? A apparently self-organized, eh? Mr. Crouch raised his eyebrows at Bagman. We agreed not to make an announcement until all the details. Oh, details, said Bagman, waving the ward away like it was a cloud of mistage. They've signed, haven't they? They've agreed, haven't they? I bet anything those kids will show soon enough anyway. I mean, it's happening at Hogwarts. Lupo, we need to meet the Bulgarians, you know, Mr. Crouch sharply, cutting Bulgman's remark short. Thank you for the tea. Weatherby, he pushed his under-drunk tea back at Percy and waited for Lupo to rise. Bagman struggled to his feet, wincing down the last of his tea, in the gold in his pocket clinking merrily. See you later, he said. I'll broke up the top box, and I'm committing. He waved squarely at Crouch and nodded curtly. Both of them had deapparated. "What's happening at Hogwarts, Dad?" said Fred at once. "What were they talking about?" "You'll find out soon enough," said Mr. Weasley, smiling. "It's classified information until such time as the Ministry decides to release it," said Percy stiffly. Mr. Crouch was quite right not to disclose it. "Oh, shut up, weather boy," said Fred, in a sense of excitement rose like a palpable cloud over the campsite. In the afternoon wore on. By dusk it was still summer, and the air itself seemed to be quivering in aspiration, and the dark spread like a curtain over the thousands of waiting wizards. At last, Vesterage and pronounced the disapparition, and the Ministry seemed to have blown the invincible and stopped fighting the signs of Baltent magic. Now, breaking out everywhere, salesmen were apparating every few feet, carrying trays and pushing carts full of extraordinary merchandise, and luminous rockets in Green Island, red for Bulgaria, which were the squeak of the names of the players, pointed green hats, and checked with dancing squalms rocks, Bulgarian scarves anchored with lions that really roared, flags from both countries, and played with their national anthems as they waved their tiny models of the tiny models of firebolts that really flew, the collectible figures of famous players which strolled across the palm of your hand and treated themselves. "Been saving my pockets money for this all summer for this," Ron told Harry, as he and Hermione strolled along the salesman, buying souvenirs. Though Ron purchased a dancing shamrock hat and had a large green rocket, he also bought a small figure of Victor Crumb, the Bulgarian seeker. A miniature Victor Crumb walked backwards and forward on Ron's hands, scowling at the green Roosevelt over him. "Wow, look at these," said Harry, hurrying to the cart piled high with what looked like brass binoculars, except they were covered in all sorts of weird knobs and dials. "All moculars," said the salesman eagerly. "You can replay action and slow down everything. Flash up play-by-play, breakdown if you need to. Bulgarian, 10 gallons each. I wish I had brought this now," said Ron, gesturing at his dancing shamrock hat and gazing normally at the binoculars. 3 pairs, said Harry firmly at the wizards. "Don't bother," said Ron, going red. He has always been touchy about the fact Harry had inherited a small tune from his parents, had much more money than he did. "He won't be getting anything for Christmas," Harry told him, thrusting the binoculars into Hermione's hands. "For about 10 years, mind." "Fair enough," said Ron, grinning. "Oh, thanks, Harry," said Hermione. "I bet I'll get us some programs. Look, there in her money bag, considerably lighter, when they went back to the tent. Bill and Charlie and Ginny were all sporting green rosters too. Mrs. Weasley was carrying an Irish flag. Fred George had no souvenirs at all, because they had given bagmen all their gold." At the deep, booming, going sound beyond the woods at once, the green-red lantern blazing into life at the trees, lighting the patch to the field. "It's time," said Mr. Weasley, as exciting as any of them. "Come on, let's go."